All right, thank you, Bill, and welcome everyone to the second session of our webinar on moral injury experienced by children and adolescents within the child welfare system. In our first session, we described moral injury as the psychological, social, and spiritual harm caused by events in high-stakes situations that transgress our most deeply held core moral beliefs. We presented original research with young people focusing on their experiences as children and adolescents in the child welfare system. This is the first research on moral injury in childhood and adolescence. It is essentially an existence proof. It shows that some children and adolescents involved in the child welfare system do experience moral injury, but there's still much to learn, for example, about prevalence and developmental outcomes. What we did learn is that children and adolescents may experience as morally injurious such events as child maltreatment, the failure of adults to protect or listen to them in high-stakes situations, and assaults to core identities, for example, as Roma or Indigenous people. Our young people described that these moral injuries are burdens that they carry with them into adulthood. We also reflected on how investigators, caseworkers, and supervisors might minimize the risk of moral injury at the individual client level, that is, through their own interactions with children and youth, and through referrals to treatment modalities, such as narrative therapy and cognitive behavior therapy, where issues of meaning are addressed. The original research described in these webinars was supported by the Gamble-Skogmo Endowment and the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Next slide, please. Today, we'll be looking more closely at the context in which moral injury occurs. But before we get to that material, I'd like to review some major themes from yesterday's presentation, especially for those of you who are just joining us today. And I'd like to do this review through a discussion of Anya's life story. Anya was one of our participants. Her life story illustrates multiple types of morally injurious events that we described during our first session, as well as remarkable resiliency. At the time of the interview, Anya was 22 years old. She's a young Black woman with a college degree, a stable career, and a young child. She entered care at the age of 6, along with her 2 younger siblings. They spent 1 year in kinship care and the next 10 years in traditional foster care. It's noteworthy that Anya did not describe moral injury as occurring in her birth home, where her mother struggled with addiction. She explained that she had adapted to neglectful conditions at home, where she nonetheless felt a sense of belonging and value as a caregiver for her siblings. In contrast, she experienced as morally injurious what she perceived to be exploitation, abuse, and betrayal in supposed places of refuge from her mother's addiction, that is, kinship care, foster care, and social service agencies, by individuals entrusted with her care. Anya described 5 episodes of moral injury, the first occurring when Anya was 7 and living in kinship care. Although this home was familiar to her, it was not experienced as a place of nurturance or even security. Anya related, quote, "Before my foster home, I was placed in a family placement with my great aunt. She kept me and my brother and my sister for 1 year. She collected a check on all of us, which would have been anywhere between $1,500 and $2,000 each month, to go ahead and pay her mortgage. She was in foreclosure, so she used us long enough to get her house out of foreclosure and gave us back. So that's when we went to the foster home," end of quote. Anya experienced her foster home, a stable placement with experienced foster parents, as a psychologically and physically dangerous place. Here, Anya experienced multiple forms of moral injury over a 10-year period, including physical abuse, deceit, and most salient, psychological abuse, the devastating effects of which she still struggles. In this home, her foster mother made it very clear that Anya and the other foster children were not valued, did not belong, and were not welcome. Anya explained, Quote, the foster mother was very, very emotionally abusive. Some days she just loves you and you're the golden child. And the next day you're worth nothing but the scum under her shoe. And she made it very, very clear. She would ignore us. You weren't allowed to talk to her. You weren't allowed to look at her. She said it's her world, we're just living in it. Like she would just say stupid stuff, things that you really didn't even need to say. Me, my brother, and my sister were all dark-skinned, and the other foster kids were light-skinned. So we had to sit on opposite sides of the table. We were referred to as the darkies. They were referred to as the lighties. And there was this notion that if you were lighter, you were better. And the foster parent was of lighter skin. She was Black, but she was very light-skinned. So she was better than everybody. She referred to herself as a goddess, and we were her slaves, essentially. So I didn't feel like I was a kid. I literally felt like I was a slave there. And I think that's where my low self-esteem developed. It was just drilled in my head that I wasn't good enough. I wasn't pretty enough. I was too dark. There's nothing that I could do that was good enough. And sometimes I still struggle with it. End of quote. In addition to the moral injury she described in kinship and foster care, Anya experienced moral injury, that is a high score on the betrayal subscale of the NEAS, from professionals who refused to hear her cries for help. When asked if she had told a caseworker about the psychological and physical abuse she and her siblings experienced in the foster home, Anya replied, quote, we did, but they never believed us. The foster parent's a master manipulator. She could do something and we could report it. And then by the time they get done speaking with her, they don't go any further with it. They just say, quote, the kids are lying, whatever, whatever, end of quote. Anya contrasted this experience with being believed by her summer camp counselors. Summer camp was Anya's refuge. Here she could behave as a child and feel affirmed by her counselors. Indeed, these counselors were the only adults who believed her accounts of abuse and neglect. Quote, so they were aware of what was going on, and I would explain to them what's going on, and they believed me. But it was just so hard to prove because of how great a manipulator the foster mother was. So once somebody believed me, I was better able to deal with it, end of quote. Anya continued to receive financial support from transition services and graduated from college. At the time of the interview, she was working as a child welfare professional and raising a young child. She disclosed that part of her motivation to go into child welfare were her morally injurious experiences of not being heard and helped as a child. She explained, quote, I knew that the system was broken. There were several times where I mentioned that something was happening to me and nobody did anything about it. And I just felt like my being in those shoes and me being the kids that I'm working with today, I'll be able to look at things from a little different perspective. They always say, hey, we want to do what's in the best interest of the child. And because I've been that child, I feel like I have a better understanding of best interests. Next slide, please. So today, in session 2, we'll look a little more closely at the context in which child welfare involved children and adolescents reported moral injury. Again, from the perspective of emerging adults between the ages of about 18 and 25. Where did these injuries occur? Who were the perpetrators and targets of these injuries? How do cultural contexts come into play? We'll also consider implications for systems change that may minimize the risk of moral injury to children and youth. Next slide, please. So why consider context? Well, particular places, relationships, and cultural settings shape our moral expectations and responses to the violation of those expectations. We develop moral expectations, for example, the behavior of our loved ones within the home. We may have other expectations for other relationships and places, for example, strangers at a shopping mall. Moral injury perpetrated by those most trusted within our familiar and presumably safe environments may be among the most severe. Now, important physical context for children involved in the child welfare system may include birth homes, foster homes, social service agencies, the courts. Important social contexts may include significant relationships with birth parents and siblings, foster family members, and child welfare and other helping professionals. Cultural context also shapes moral expectations. Individuals involved in the U.S. child welfare system, children, families, child welfare workers, administrators, policymakers, are embedded within various cultural contexts. Aspects of their moral frameworks may be culturally widespread and therefore shared, for example, prohibition against harming vulnerable children, but other aspects of those moral frameworks are culturally nuanced. For example, what constitutes appropriate discipline? Child welfare policies and practices that appear neutral to those within positions of power may be experienced as morally injurious by those with less power. For example, parents from historically marginalized communities whose culturally based child rearing practices may be discredited. Next slide, please. So we wanted to understand what are the physical, social, and cultural contexts of moral injury for children in the child welfare system. Next slide, please. We recruited 28 ethnically diverse emerging adults with foster care histories from 4 Midwestern states. Next slide, please. We collected in-depth information on these young people's lives to understand their experiences of moral injury. To review from session 1, we administered the Moral Injury Event Scale, a 9-item self-report Likert scale that identifies moral transgressions of other people, moral transgressions of the self, and it also has a betrayal subscale. We also conducted individual audio recorded interviews, in-depth interviews, where participants elaborated on their niece responses in the context of a life story that included their involvement in child welfare. Next slide, please. So, our results. What did we find? Where do morally injurious events occur? Next slide, please. So this table shows the places where participants reported morally injurious behavior occurred. Down the side, we see that they describe the birth home, out-of-home placements, and social service settings as among the places where moral injury occurred. Across the top, we, just for simplicity's sake, included the 2 most frequent types of moral injury reported by participants, as well as a total column that sums across all types of moral injury. The number in the table is the number of young people reporting moral injury in this place, and the parenthesis indicates the percentage of the total sample. As you can see, the most frequent place for moral injury to occur for child maltreatment, failure to protect, and total is out-of-home placements. Birth homes and social service agencies also were relatively frequently mentioned. Failure to protect at social service agencies typically involved an adult helping professional not taking action after a child reported maltreatment or some other significant problem, or not believing or listening to the child's report. Other places less frequently noted and not listed on this table included the courts, schools, and neighborhoods. Next slide, please. So who perpetrates morally injurious events? Who's responsible? Who initiates these events? Next slide, please. So this table shows the people who perpetrated the morally injurious behaviors. And again, down the side, we see self, parent, substitute caregiver, and child welfare professionals. There were others, such as peers and educators, but the ones listed on the table were the most frequently mentioned. And then across the top, we only included, again, the most frequent morally injurious actions, as well as a total column summing across. The number, again, is the number of young people reporting, and the parenthesis indicates the percentage of the total sample. As you can see, parents, substitute caregivers, and child welfare professionals all were relatively frequently mentioned. And again, note that one can experience moral injury due to one's own actions or failure to act. And nearly half of the sample of young people experienced moral injury on the basis of what they had done or failed to do. Next slide, please. So this slide provides a few examples of perpetrators and places of moral injury described by our participants. So Edward identified himself as a perpetrator of moral injury in his out-of-home placement. He was sexually abused by a foster family, and at the time of the interview described crushing feelings of guilt for acting out sexually on his younger sister when he was a child. Sharon identified a child welfare professional as a perpetrator of moral injury at a social service agency. She described that her worker failed to listen or respect her request to forego visitation with her mother, who was actively using. Alma identified a foster parent as a perpetrator of moral injury in her foster home. Her foster parents refused to recognize her Indigenous heritage or help her to participate in a ceremony that was very important to her. Ruby identified her birth parents as perpetrators of moral injury at home. They continued to misuse drugs at home, even though this lifestyle exposed her to dangerous people and situations and resulted in her placement in foster care as they continued to refuse treatment. Next slide, please. This slide describes the targets of morally injurious behavior. Individuals can experience moral injuries from behavior directed at them, but also by witnessing morally transgressive behaviors directed at others. All participants describe themselves as targets of morally injurious behavior. In addition, participants described experiencing moral injury from witnessing morally transgressive behavior against others, other children, for example, younger siblings being maltreated or unprotected by parents or foster caregivers. Also, 2 young people reported experiencing moral injury from witnessing their mothers being physically assaulted by their fathers. Next slide, please. Emerging adults' description of events also indicate that young people of color experience some unique vulnerabilities relative to white children. They describe disconnections between birth cultures and out-of-home placements, and similar to Anya in our opening example, racism and colorism. Next slide, please. So Diana's case illustrates some challenges of a BIPOC child involved in the child welfare system. She experienced a disconnection between her birth culture and that of her adopted family, and also rejection by her family of origin because of her adoption by a white family. So at the time of our study, Diana was a 21-year-old college student studying social work. As a toddler, Diana had immigrated to Chicago from Poland with her birth family, who were undocumented. Her birth family is Roma. Her birth mother was 14 at the time of Diana's birth. Diana was especially close to her maternal grandmother. Although she entered care at 3, she continued visitation with her birth family until she was adopted at age 9 into a white family. Diana described experiencing several moral injuries during middle childhood and early adolescence around her identity as Roma. Given her dark skin and hair, she was often mistaken for Latina. She explained, quote, "I went to Catholic school. I don't speak Spanish. The school is very Hispanic, very Christian, very different. And I'm telling people, oh, I'm Roma, because I didn't know what to say when they mistook me for Latina. I'm just Roma." And they're like, gypsies don't exist. They were so mean. I was like, oh my God, I don't exist, end of quote. Diana also experienced an injury of identity from her family of origin. Quote, "I feel like I really missed out on a lot of culture. It's kind of difficult because Roma are very our people, only people. Like I can't go back and learn my language because they won't teach me. My grandma and other Roma, once I was ready to be adopted, they were like, yeah, she can't come back because she's been too exposed to not our culture. It's like I don't belong anywhere. Next slide, please. So before we move on to consider implications, we would really like to hear your thoughts. Do the data we've presented in these first two sessions resonate with your own professional experiences? And if so, we'd really like to hear about those experiences. Now you can either type in the chat or use the hand raise function and we'll turn on your mic. But just remember the session is being recorded. And we'll give people a few minutes to think about it. Can you find your hand raise function? Down along the bottom there?
The chat is also open.
Great. Again, we are not experts on this. We're just learning about this, and it's extremely helpful to hear from people who are on the ground doing this work. Well, why don't you keep thinking about this, and we will go on. Oh, here we go. Excellent. We have several comments. Let me see. I'm going to just read them to you. One person wrote, yes, definitely. As a foster care licensing social worker, I definitely witnessed this with some of the kiddos in my care. And another person says, I can think of cases in my former office that the youth may have experienced that loss, denial of identity around placement and after. And another person said, yes, this does resonate. Hold on. I've had clients complain that they cannot eat familiar food because their host families do not like the smell of the seasonings. Another person wrote, this resonates with me personally. I'm a transracial adoptee from Korea. My adopted family is white, and I was raised in a very small northern Minnesota town with very, very few minorities. I lost my culture. My adoptive mother was emotionally abusive and failed to protect me and my sister from sexual abuse. Yes. Sorry to hear that. But thank you for sharing that. Yes, as a guardian ad litem, I have had to fight with the county to take the children's allegations of abuse by a foster care provider seriously, instead of dismissing because the foster provider denies it. Yes. Another one. Several years ago, I was involved in a project and had several focus groups with older teens in childcare. They talked about how they didn't feel part of a family, how many foster mothers would not let them do their laundry or develop independent living skills. They wanted to be prepared to live independently after foster care, but their foster parents resisted helping them acquire these skills. And another comment, I'm a foster care worker. I have seen instances that the children are more severely traumatized being put into care than when they were with their biological families. And it is true that moral injuries are among the most painful of human experiences. And when we don't attend to that emotional well-being, we're again adding additional burdens to children who are already have burdens. These are really helpful, and I thank you for these comments. Is there anything else? And again, feel free to raise your hands and respond or talk more. All right, thank you. And you'll have another opportunity to do this, to respond as well. So let's move on then. The next slide, please. Okay. So what are the implications of our data at the systems level? Last time in the first session, Johara, who is an LICSW and therapist, talked about ways of mitigating or minimizing the experience of moral injury at the individual client level. But what about at the systems level? So the pervasiveness of morally injurious events. Oh, next slide, please. I'm sorry. So the pervasiveness of morally injurious events experienced by emerging adults across the physical, social, and cultural context of their child welfare involvement point to a need for system reform, specifically the prioritization of children's emotional safety alongside of their physical safety. Some of the moral injuries experienced by emerging adults were perpetrated by child welfare professionals and foster caregivers. System reform is necessary to ensure that children's involvement in the child welfare system does not add additional burdens of moral injury as they grow and navigate adulthood. Next slide, please. So what might that system reform look like? First, in order for caseworkers to provide the kind of consistency and support for youth, caseloads cannot be as overwhelming as they frequently are. This is widely understood and discussed, yet caseloads are often too large for caseworkers to spend the kind of time and attention they want on each child and family in their care. These large caseloads often lead to reduced quality of care, burnout, high caseworker turnover, and as we learned from our previous research, moral injury. So child welfare workers in our previous research described experiencing moral injury as a result of their work in an adversarial child welfare system and exposure to systemic biases, child abuse, and poor quality services. They also communicated feelings such as rage, betrayal, grief, guilt, and shame associated with moral injury. Some described troubling existential issues, including their ability to function as ethical professionals within a system they viewed as deeply flawed and steeped in human misery. Many professionals described themselves or colleagues as actively seeking employment elsewhere. So manageable caseload. Second, there are a lot of professional development opportunities available for staff, and of course, continuing education requirements for licensure. Yet these opportunities are often prescribed on top of very intense packed schedules. Increased access also means opening up the time and space for staff to attend these trainings without sacrificing their necessary self-care and continued support following training to ensure learning and implementation. In addition, performance evaluation that prioritize outcomes that include measures of emotional and psychological wellness, along with incentives for staff to attend to these outcomes, may increase the motivation for caseworkers to invest energy towards aspects of moral injury. And next, diversity and equity work is increasingly common in the workplace. Yet many staff and clients experience this as surface level work that is yet to prove successful in creating an environment that can retain its marginalized identity holding staff or produce work that feels equitable to marginalized identity holding clients. Increased funding towards programs that are created and run by BIPOC, LGBTQ+, multilingual, anti-ableist, spiritually diverse individuals, while holding administrators accountable for maintaining administrator and staff participation in those programs may be helpful in creating more culturally appropriate and supportive services for cases. Next slide, please. So again, these are just some ideas. And before we move on to questions, again, we would really like to hear your thoughts on any systems level changes you would advocate for to minimize moral injury for children and youth while they're in the system. Again, you can either type in the chat or use the hand raise function and we'll turn on your mic. But just remember, again, the session is being recorded. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and read some of these that came in. Okay, so let's see. I think one of the most harmful things that happens to kids when they in foster care is when they feel they are not heard by their foster parents and social workers. And man, that just really resonates with what our young participants said. It impacts their self-esteem because this lack of being heard makes them feel unvalued, or as one of our participants said, like garbage. It's so important that foster parents and social workers acknowledge they hear what the child is saying and acknowledge their experiences, even if they choose not to act differently, even if they choose to act differently than what the child wants. Yes. All right, let's see. And then another comment. Okay, wait a second. I think, okay. Let me see. I 100% agree with that first implication. Thank you. The kind of care that our families need and deserve require more focus, time, and intentionality. And such high caseloads do not allow, let's see, and such high caseloads do not allow a realistic ability for social workers to do the hard work we want to do, and more importantly, that our families deserve. As a parent with my own bio children, I find that there are always issues that they will feel were deficient growing up. It is difficult in foster care to get foster parents, and we seem to put more belief into what they say than the children. We want to hang on to our valuable resources. It isn't realistic to think that children will get into adulthood without in an environment where they may never feel like they fit in like family. So where does this leave the state on what can be achieved for children in foster care? Those are excellent points. Another post, as a foster parent trainer, this topic has not been introduced in the curriculum. I suspect this will change. And we are, of course, more than happy to provide any help or information or support in terms of training. Just email me. That's part of the charge of the Gamble-Skogmo Endowment, is to help out and provide support to our valued workers. All right, another comment: mandatory regular mental health debriefings for social workers and supervisors to help prevent burnout, secondary trauma, and moral distress from converting to moral injury. Exactly. Many of the emotions that we described as morally injurious are normal reactions. If you didn't have moral injury when you observe or experiencing some of these events, that we would be concerned. And it's only when that moral pain, those typical reactions, grief, guilt, shame, rage, when we can't cope with those, perhaps because it's coming one event after the other, and we've not had an opportunity or space to process that. It's only when we can't cope with those feelings that it becomes moral injury. So that's really interesting to say that, okay, you may be feeling some moral distress, and if we can provide support, we can maybe prevent that from becoming moral injury. So that is a very insightful comment. Thank you. Okay, to continue, increased use of protective supervision with court oversight rather than removal and foster care placement as discussed, foster placement often are not better and can be even worse than the birth home. Another comment, it's important to remember that the vast majority of our foster parents want to do right by these kids and need social work support and education to do so. And that is absolutely right. And I would not want anyone to come away from this webinar feeling like we are attacking or dumping on social workers, caseworkers, or foster care providers. Many are doing excellent work. And when we present tomorrow, the young people, you will hear from the young people how those relationships were instrumental to them, that those supportive relationships, those positive relationships with professionals and foster parents have helped them to heal from moral injury. So we tend to talk about the dramatic and the negative cases, but I am well aware and want to emphasize and appreciate the important and good work that most, I would say, foster parents and child welfare workers, professionals are doing. All right, let's see. Better monitoring of foster homes. For example, random drug testing of foster parents, not just birth parents. Another comment. We know from research the importance of developing meaningful relationships with families as well as kids. Exactly. High caseloads decrease child welfare workers' ability to do this. I'd love to see a study that compares outcomes for families with kids with child welfare workers that have low caseloads versus those with high caseloads. My hypothesis is the time families are involved in the child welfare system would be lower in those instances where their child welfare worker had a low caseload. I certainly, I suspect you are correct. That's a very good observation. All right. Thank you for these wonderful comments. One new message. Let's see. Okay. Agency staff needs to remember that foster parents are not paid staff. Sometimes we social workers can forget that these people are paid a small stipend to take care of our vulnerable youth while still juggling their own lives and obligations. Yes. All right. All right. Thank you. We'll continue to monitor the chat, and if there are more comments coming in, we'll be sure to read them out. Thank you very much. Can we go to the next slide, please? Tomorrow is perhaps going to be the most important of this 3-session webinar. We will be presenting young people's description of what has helped them to soothe moral injury and move on with their lives in a positive direction, as well as their advice to adults, child welfare professionals, and foster parents, and to other foster children and youth. So I hope to see you tomorrow. Now, do you have any questions for me? If you do have additional questions, if you could just type them into the Q&A. Oh, here's a question. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between a traumatic event versus a morally injurious event? That's a really good question. Moral injury often co-occurs with trauma. So an example of that would be, say, say childhood sexual abuse. There might be a trauma aspect, but there's also a moral injury aspect. And trauma, of course, can occur without moral injury. So the example I always think of is a car accident on an icy road. And then, of course, moral injury can occur without physical trauma. So I think of an example. This is a really good example. It's an actual example of a young man who was a brilliant clarinetist, and his heart's desire was to study with one of the top clarinetists in the country, and that was across the country. He wanted to move across the country, and he applied to be this person's student, and he received a rejection email. And then a couple of years later, he happened upon this, the person he wanted to study with, and the person asked him, well, why didn't you accept my invitation to study with me? And it turned out that his girlfriend at the time had intercepted the communication between the communication that accepted the young man into the program, and instead substituted a rejection. And so this was an incredible moral injury to him that did not involve trauma. Also, we can think about trauma. Some of the primary aspects of trauma involve anxiety and arousal, whereas moral injury, it's more about meaning. It's more about the moral emotions, they're called, like guilt and shame, but also rage, feelings of betrayal, and also certain existential issues, like do I have worth as a human being? That's what we hear a lot from the young people in our study, feeling that they do not have worth as a human being. Parents in our earlier studies questioned whether or not they could function as parents. And child welfare workers in our previous study wondered if they could function ethically in a system that they viewed as problematic. So anyway, that I hope that answers your question. And I also, as you think about this material, if you're interested in participating with us and learning more, email me. If you want more information, we have several publications that we can send you. So just email me, and we're more than happy to partner in any way we can with community members.
Wendy, there is a question in the Q&A.
Oh, okay. Well, let me go down. I'm looking at the chat here. Okay, based on what you learned from the young people you interviewed for your study, what changes would you like to see in the child welfare system? I do think it's important to acknowledge that most child welfare workers and foster parents are doing their best given the training and support they receive, and that much more training and support is needed by both. And again, I want to underscore that I understand that. People do not go into they go into child welfare to help, to support families, to support children, because they care, and it's part of their it's a deep part of their values. And the problem is when they get caught up in complex systems where they're not able to act on those values, and in fact may act in ways that are counter to those values. And so some of the information that we talked about today in terms of like reduced caseloads, more emphasis on emotional safety, a less adversarial system. We have a very adversarial system. That's not the case with all child welfare systems across the world. For example, in Japan, the child welfare system is decoupled from the criminal justice system, from the courts. Parents are typically do not have their parental rights severed in that cultural context, but they are worked with and supported over a long period of time while protecting children. So again, in Scotland, the courts and the child welfare system are separate. So there are a variety of complicated, I mean, the system is very complex, and I don't pretend to be an expert, but those are just a couple of the um, uh, areas that our participants have emphasized. Now, tomorrow, we're going to hear from the youth. What do they think needs to change? What do they want adults to do to better support them?
Wendy, there's a question in the chat. How do you feel about decisions workers make against their better judgment that lead to moral injury?
Well, what we heard from workers in our earlier research was that having to act against their moral beliefs resulted in feelings of moral injury and questioning their ability to function ethically in the child welfare system and leading to decisions kind of to leave. So it happens, and it also happens with nurses. There's a literature on moral injury and moral distress in nursing that talks about exactly what you're bringing up in the context of nursing, where nurses are forced to provide care or not provide care because they've been ordered to do so by doctors or those higher in positions of higher authority, and just how devastating that can be. And it's the same way with workers. That again, most workers, I firmly believe, go into this field because they want to help families, and that's their moral beliefs. That's part of who they are. And when they have to act in ways against those beliefs, act in ways that they perceive as hurting those families because of rules and regulations or requirements, then that is morally injurious. So how do I feel about that? I think it's tragic. We have very high turnover, as you know, and that reflects the harm to workers, and it's also, as you know, really bad for kids and families. Now, I hope that this time next year, maybe we can be in person, because I would like to. I really appreciate people writing questions and writing in the chat, but I also recognize that it's a little bit awkward and would really like to hear more from you. But thank you so much for your questions and your comments. Stacy, can we turn it over to you now?
Okay, thank you so much, Wendy, for that presentation, and for everybody who wrote in the chat and shared their reflections and their questions. We really appreciate it. So again, for those asking about CEUs and post tests will be emailed out to you in the next week. And if you attended yesterday and were unable to sign in on the Google form, we'll be sure to get you your CEUs because we'll have a record of attendance. As we mentioned, this webinar will be recorded and it'll also be emailed out to all attendees and posted on CASHU's website. When we exit out, there'll be a brief evaluation, just about 5 questions. If you would complete that, we would really appreciate it. And like Wendy mentioned, if you have more questions for her about moral injury or want to have a discussion, she's really open to sort of feedback and conversation. So feel free to email her as well. Please join us tomorrow. As Wendy mentioned, we will be having our third webinar of this series, Developing a Positive Life Philosophy to Soothe Moral Injury, Insights from Emerging Adults. So we hope to see you there. Thanks to everybody for attending, and thanks again, Wendy, for the wonderful presentation.